psychomedical tradition, there we go, to describe people whose identities do not fit their assigned gender at birth. First, describing people with gender identities that we might say are opposite to their assigned gender at birth, and then expanding to describe people with a wider array of gender identities that are discordant with their assigned gender at birth. And it's within this context specifically that non-binary emerged as a label to describe people whose gender identities fall irreconcilably outside of the male-female binary that we've inherited from this intellectual tradition. So we're necessarily rooted in Euro-American assumptions, and we cannot claim that our debates over trans identity are universal to the human experience, except to the extent that colonization has forced cultures globally to conform to this kind of psychomedical norm and set of expectations we've inherited from European and colonial American tradition. So against that kind of historical and conceptual backdrop, I want to present a critique of feminist thought about transgender identity. And it's important that the feminist thought in question, as it dominates our field and is taught in our university classrooms, traces to similarly Euro-American origins. Even, for example, Black feminist thought in the United States has really marked itself in opposition to this. So the critique I'm levying here is less applicable directly to a Black feminist thought and other post-colonial feminist thought, but is relevant in this context. So it's within this system of binary male-female gender roles that feminist thought has emerged, right? Feminist thought is fundamentally rooted in and continues to be heavily invested in a model of sexual subordination in which men and women are discrete categories, and the former subordinates the latter. So misogyny, the ideology that supports this hierarchy, works through social and cultural systems to maintain male dominance, and these systems are frequent targets of feminist criticism. But transgender theory challenges this thinking by disrupting the hierarchy of domination that feminist theory is invested in. Where does the trans man fall in the hierarchy of male over female domination? Is he now a dominator of women by virtue of his transition? Where does the trans woman fall? Is she now dominated by men? Or, as trans exclusionary radical feminists have argued, is she a dominator of real, which is to say cisgender or non-transgender women, by virtue of the sex that she was assigned at birth? Where does the non-binary person fall, whose existence challenges the binary required for this hierarchical understanding of power? How do we kind of restack the flow chart here of power to include trans people if we're going to maintain feminist theory's insistence on a hierarchy of domination? Well, trans theory would say that we don't restack that flow chart. See, if we dig below the surface of feminist theory's attempts to incorporate transgender identity, we see that transness is always understood vis-a-vis womanhood. So accordingly, trans women are only legible as women who have become women. Trans men are only legible as men who were socialized as women, and non-binary people are only legible to the extent that their oppression can be located within the template of misogyny. So for example, the presentation of femininity in somebody assigned male at birth who should not have it. In both feminist scholarship and what has been described as popular feminism, the result of this thinking is a common refrain of women and non-binary people, where non-binary is a euphemism for basically saying woman light. And to be perfectly clear, the non-binary people who are meant to be included in this social and political coalition are never really non-binary people who were assigned male at birth. It's always non-binary people who are assigned female at birth, who are then being reincorporated into their sex assignment. Like I said, women and women light. As for trans men, they tend to be excluded from this thinking altogether. Systems that are meant to protect women and non-binary people from men, or to critique male power over women and non-binary people, exclude trans men from that equation. They're simply lumped in with cisgender men as though they are the same, as though trans men have equal access to the wealth of cis male privilege without experiencing their own gender-based marginalization, which of course is ridiculous to say. And of course, we'll all be familiar with the debates that have waged and that continue to wage over the inclusion of trans women in the category of women. Most famously, contemporary British feminism is having a moment of trans exclusionary panic as kind of old refrains about trans women being male interlopers in women's space have re-emerged. So in short, feminist thinking cannot accommodate transgender realities. Not because feminist theory is bad, but because it wasn't built to describe and analyze the system of gender that we currently have. It was built to analyze a system that does not entirely exist anymore in our contemporary societies, and that did not necessarily ever exist in some other societies. So where do we turn? Well, in recent decades, queer theory has promised to overcome the limitations of feminism through a radical project of gender subversion. So whereas feminist theory is invested in a model of binaristic sexual subordination, queer theory is at the kind of completely opposite end, invested in the deconstruction of the male-female binary as a means of unraveling heteronormativity. So queer theorists often interpret transness in one of two key ways vis-a-vis this political project. So from one queer theoretical perspective, transness is understood as some kind of like ultimate form of queerness that manifests literally the metaphor of gender transgression. And so trans people are only legible to the extent that they embody like a clearly, obviously visible subversion of gender norms. From the other perspective, though, transness contradictorily represents an anti-queer impulse toward binary conformity. It's a failure of the queer political project as individuals reject the liberation of queerness and instead assimilate into heteronormative binary gender conformity. So from a queer theoretical perspective then, transgender identity is bad to the extent that it upholds the validity of binary gender identity, and good to the extent that it disrupts the binary gender system. So trans identity disrupts this model of theorizing as trans people kind of variously identify with and against a binary gender system in a complex field of multiply valid identities, right? A binary trans woman's identity is not invalid because of its binary nature. A trans man may also be queer. His binary identity doesn't mean he participates in the project of heteronormativity. And a non-binary person's non-binary identity may or may not be visible or visibly apparent to passing strangers. So in short, queer theory can't really accommodate transgender realities because trans people cannot have their identity simply read through the queer political fantasy of counternormativity. They're real people with real lives that aren't part of a political project in that way. So what do we do instead? Well, my argument is that instead of chopping off transgender studies heel to fit into feminist and queer theory slipper, instead of letting transgender scholarship be dominated by feminist and queer scholars, we need to develop a distinctly transgender mode of critique. As for what that mode looks like, I'm really encouraged by the burgeoning body of work that is rooted in the productive practices of trans people coming to understand how the community constructs its own mode of existence and embodiment rather than importing an inherited set of theoretical ideas from feminist and queer theory. And I also think that such a model should analyze gender not as a category of oppression, but rather as a vector of oppression. Your oppression by gender is not by virtue of which category you fall into, but rather by the existence of a gender system altogether, which I think would be a beneficial shift for queer and feminist theorizing as well. I want to turn now then to my own research in the context of media studies to more specifically diagnose the problems I outlined with feminist and queer theory, and to discuss how I aim and how my students aim to produce a transgender specific mode of critique in my own and in our own work. So studies of trans media thus far have tended to employ perspectives from feminist theory and queer theory to analyze transgender representation. And they've done this both in studies of cis-produced media, so mass media produced by a cisgender audience for a cisgender public, and trans-produced media, so things we're probably most typically aware of like YouTube and other such sites where trans people can produce their own media content. However, doing so using feminist and queer theory to critique these representations has really posed analytic problems for the burgeoning field of transmedia studies. So in line with the modes of theorizing that I've already critiqued, feminist media critics have tended to analyze transgender representations that uphold misogyny as bad and those that oppose it as good. Though, as I've said, where we locate misogyny in this is hard to say. And for their part, queer media critics have tended to analyze transgender representations that uphold the validity of binary gender as bad and those that disrupt the binary system as good. So no surprises there. But these perspectives are, as I've said, theoretically limited. But beyond these theoretical limitations, both approaches also present methodological shortcomings. Feminist and queer theories claim to offer a more rigorous excavation of subjectivities than other approaches. But they've tended to do so via analyses, often textual, that superimpose the political investments of the theorist, so counter-subordination and anti-normativity respectively, over the objectified trans figure. So in doing so, these theorists ironically project their own universalized interests onto the trans people or trans media figures whose identities they're claiming to excavate. For instance, let's consider two competing readings of the germinal transgender media text, Paris is Burning. For those of you who are not familiar, Paris is Burning is a documentary from the early 90s by Jenny Livingston that was an investigation of the largely Black and Latina and largely trans, but also more broadly queer ballroom scene in New York City. And so the two really important readings here that I want to analyze are those by Black feminist theorist Bell Hooks and queer theorist Judith Butler, to kind of demonstrate the limitations I'm arguing this line of thinking has. So for her part, Bell Hooks reads the representation of trans women in Paris is Burning as being bad representations because they uphold the subordination of Black women by normalizing aspiration to what she calls a sexist ideal of white womanhood. She basically reads the desire for financial security and luxury that many of these poor Black trans women have as fundamentally being anti-Black and anti-woman because they think that their Blackness and their Black womanhood is insufficient and they aspire to whiteness. Alternatively, Judith Butler reads the trans women in Paris is Burning, and specifically Venus Extravaganza, who's a trans Latina woman who was murdered during the course of the film, as a failure of the subversive power of drag. So because trans women in Paris is Burning desire to transform their sexed bodies into congruence with their gender identities, but Butler says that they reinscribed rather than subverted the heterosexual matrix that maintains the normative alignment of sex and gender. So these trans women representations are bad because they don't live out this political fantasy of gender performance. But neither reading that we get from either of these theorists attends fully to the material realities of trans of color life, or the subjective experiences of gender as lived by the women in the film. So when queer and feminist theorists read trans media representations as good or bad based on their amenability to a counter-subordination or an anti-normativity paradigm, trans subjectivities become a means to an end in furthering queer and feminist investments. But where is the trans subject in such an approach to media studies? Trans people don't get to exist on their own terms or to construct their own values. They simply exist as pawns to further the critique of the feminist or queer theorist. So we find ourselves then in need of new theoretical models for and methodological approaches to the analysis of transgender media representations, one that is specific to trans subjectivity in order to overcome the limitations of feminist and queer approaches. And my students and I have turned to the sociology of culture to assist in this endeavor. So sociologists of culture take up as their central concern the processes of action and interaction that shape both the expression, excuse me, and the interpretation of the meanings of publicly shared codes. So at the heart of the sociology of culture is a dichotomy between collectively shared understandings and individual acts of expression and interpretation. So cultural codes and their attendant norms of representation are neither static structures that are passively received and mindlessly replicated by individuals, nor are they infinitely fluid signifiers that can be made to mean anything. Instead, cultural codes offer a multiform repertoire of meanings to frame and reframe experience in open-ended ways, so long as that repertoire is shared among those who are in communication with one another. And the repertoire quality of cultural codes becomes especially clear when we focus on particular interacting groups, whether those groups are members of a subculture, members of some civic association, or publics formed around some shared media. And these groups develop what sociologists Nina Eliassoff and Paul Lichterman refer to as group styles, or specific and patterned ways within the group's shared culture that collective representations are used to represent particular meanings, and that may not be legible outside of that group's style. So the task for sociologists of culture then is to understand how people use collective representations to make meaning together in their local social settings in everyday life. And sociologists typically achieve this task by drawing on the field's longstanding tradition in symbolic interactionism, using ethnographic methods such as participant observation and interviewing to kind of directly observe on the ground processes of meaning making. So Wendy Griswold, a colleague here at Northwestern, a very eminent sociologist, offers perhaps the most holistic method of approach to the sociology of culture. And she identifies 4 actions that any complete analysis of a cultural object, that's what she calls them, meaning kind of an expression of social meaning that is tangible or can be put into words, must account for. And from my perspective, obviously, I'm taking cultural objects to mean things like a media text or something like that. And those 4 things are intention, or the creative agent's purpose in producing or using the cultural object; reception, or the interpretation, impact, and endurance of the cultural object over time and space; comprehension, or the interpretation of a cultural object in terms of what is already known or understood, and its kind of classification into an identifiable genre; and explanation, or the drawing of connections between the cultural object's characteristics and the wider social world that it reflects, paying attention to how those connections are mediated by intention and reception. So in using this approach, sociologists of culture attend to both the subjective experiences of producers and consumers of cultural objects and the broader sociocultural context in which those objects are produced and consumed. So this finally brings us back to our central concern, which is how does the sociology of culture open up the possibility of new transgender modes of representational critique? Well, first, it provides a necessary focus on both the interactional and the structural processes of collective meaning making. So in attending to the repertoires of cultural codes that help structure and facilitate social meaning making and the ways that those codes are filtered in different settings to produce contingent meanings, the sociology of culture approach further allows us to investigate dynamics pertaining to race and ethnicity and other lines of social inquiry, and to do so locally and concretely rather than abstractly. And using this approach allows transmedia studies to move beyond generalized categories of good and bad, understanding media instead as embedded within complex communicative processes that collectively produce meaning through social interaction among group members. So to revisit Bell Hooks and Judith Butler's respective readings of transgender representation in Paris is Burning, our perspective would intervene to focus on the repertoire of meanings that trans women mobilize within their group setting, which is understood to consist of fellow members of their interacting group. So where Judith Butler kind of overreads Venus Extravaganza's gender vis-a-vis white, excuse me, vis-a-vis white queer culture's repertoire of drag, through which lens, through which lens her gender represents a failure of performative subversion, this perspective, sorry, I'm apparently dying. This perspective attends to the meaning of her claims and performances not in analytic isolation, but within her own subcultural context. Butler is not part of the interacting group in which the meaning of Venus's gender is made, and she makes no effort to excavate the meanings that are created by that group using their own group style. Butler, like many queer and feminist theorists, reads trans women into her own group style and the repertoires of meaning in her own cultural context. But doing so does not benefit or enrich our understanding of transgender subjectivities, right? But this approach that I'm advocating for does. Second, the sociology of culture orients us toward empirical engagement with and observation of the social processes that develop cultural structures, focusing primarily on intent, behavior, and impact. So this methodological reorientation entails a necessary political reorientation, leaving behind the troubling tendency in feminist and queer theory to use transgender subjects as analytic objects through which to read gender-based subordination and gender counternormativity, respectively. This new orientation is particularly important given the realities of the digital media environment, in which transmedia representations are increasingly produced not by cis people for cis audiences, and so we can critique transgender representation on those terms, but rather it's being created by trans people for both cis and trans audiences. So in this context, we cannot presume that transmedia representation simply transmit majoritarian ideologies about minoritarian subjects. Instead, ethnographic methods better allow us to understand trans individuals as active agents, both in producing and making meaning of media. And so from this perspective, trans representations are not analyzed as good or bad, as normative or resistant. Rather, they're represented as intentional acts of symbolic communication, which are received and interpreted by audiences who comprehend those acts in the context of their existing culturally informed classification schema, and which can be explained by the social, cultural, and political context in which those acts and interpretations occur. And this analytical model must attend to localized meanings produced by interacting groups that share repertoires of cultural codes. So more specifically in the context of transmedia studies, of course, the context I'm working in, not necessarily all of you are, but it leads us as scholars of transmedia to ask, how do transmedia producers represent their identities to their audiences? How do they negotiate their transness while working in either the legacy or the new media industries? How do trans audiences receive and interpret messages about trans identity from legacy and new media? And how do cis audiences? How do trans audiences then comprehend these messages given their repertoire of cultural codes? And how does that perhaps differ for cis audiences? And finally, how do we explain the breadth of transmedia representations within broader sociocultural and political contexts? As a short, like kind of 30-second preview of this kind of mode of thinking and action, my graduate student, Eri Zhang, is currently working on a very important project looking at transgender beauty influencers. And the crux of their argument, of their findings that is using this method that we've developed, is looking at how feminist criticism, of course, has really critiqued what's often called the beauty imperative, right? The necessity for women to engage in different forms of aesthetic labor in order to maintain a base neutral status as beautiful, and the forms of self-objectification and surveillance that it required for that to happen. In Erik's empirical engagement with trans audiences and transmedia texts has led to a questioning of the degree to which that is applicable to trans audiences, particularly in the ways that queer criticism, for example, has decried the way that trans women kind of hide or kind of disown their trans identity by attempting to pass as cis women through achieving beauty. And what Erik has found in their studies with trans women and trans feminine people in the US context is that actually trans women are developing their own set of cultural codes around beauty, where they are developing shared understandings of what it means to be beautiful outside of what it means to be either A, sexually desirable, or B, to be passable as a cisgender woman. They're developing new modes of, or new codes of beauty that are trans beauty, trans-specific modes of beauty that are being beautiful, what it means to be beautiful as a trans woman. And so, as I've argued here, these questions and the analyses that we can produce with them require us to kind of harness these analytic tools to get at the specificity of trans identities and experiences, moving beyond the theoretical frameworks provided by feminist and queer theory and the limitations that their political project places on trans possibility. And this should move us, if only slowly and incrementally, toward distinctly transgender modes of representational critique. And so with that, I will thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing the next talk and discussing these ideas with you further. Thank you. Stop sharing.
Thank you for that. That was fascinating. I can't wait to hear the discussion. But first, we're going to hear from Dr. Citri. Citri is a senior faculty member at Tel Aviv University's School of Social Work and a lecturer at the Faculty of Law. He teaches and researches in the field of legal and critical theory, as well as administrative, equality, and welfare law, with a focus on issues of trans rights, gender and sexuality, race and racialization, subjectivity, and subjection. Dr. Citri earned an LLM and an SJD from the University of Toronto Faculty of Law in the collaborative programs for sexual diversity studies and Jewish studies. He is a former scholar at the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation, a graduate of the Vanier Canada program, the recipient of Governor General Gold Medal and other awards and grants. Dr. Catri's work has been cited by courts, has served as a basis for policy reforms, and is published in law journals and books in all kinds of wonderful places. Dr. Citri is also a trans community advocate. In 2011, he co-founded the Gila Project for Trans Empowerment, which mobilizes community resources to provide individual, legal, and social assistance while advocating for broader institutional change. He has also worked with the Association for Civil Rights in Israel and the Gisha Center for Freedom of Movement. I'm very excited to hear Citri's talk, and and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Ruth, for inviting me and for this very generous introduction. Thank you, Ronit and Gili, for this colloquium, and Brendan for organizing. Hi to people I know, Benjamin and Sari, maybe other people. I'm very honored to speak after TJ. I'm a fan of the Center for Applied Transgender Studies, as you all should be too. And I'm going to talk a little bit more from a legal perspective on what is now known as, or this emerging trend to recognize a non-binary sex classification, the X marker. So let's see if I can share my screen in a way that I'll be happy with. Let's see. Let's see if that works. Yeah. Okay. So this is a lovely map that you should not feel very attached to. It's just an infographic and it's outdated. But what I'm going to talk about is the rise of what is called or referred to so-called gender self-determination, and these are legal classification that one can access by self-identification, self-selection, self-declaration, and the X markers are usually a part of these kind of law and policies. So let's start, and I would just say to begin with, sex classification and public registrars more broadly of different legal data that becomes part of one's legal entity are a colonial kind of technology, and before they came to Europe, at least 200 years ago, they started in the European colonies, and they, to begin with, kind of marked who had property and who was property, and women or female at that point obviously were owned by their father and then their husbands, and race classification marked who is a slave property and who is a slave owner. So this is the historical background of where we get the sex classification to begin with. And so X markers are this new and sexy kind of like trend in legal recognition of gender identities. And so we see this announcement by the US Department of State from June 30th, declaring that from now on, US passport and consular reports of birth abroad, in those documents, people can choose their sex classification as either female or male. And they're also saying that they're gonna have another non-binary classification coming soon. And indeed, on October 28th, the US issued its first non-binary passport with an X marker. Israel, likewise, in Israel, we had an intergovernmental committee on trans rights. And one of the recommendations that might be adopted in the near future was to add a non-binary classification to the Israeli public register, or at least to have people choose not to be identified as female and male. And so we're seeing this, these classifications coming up more and more. There's about 17 countries in the world today that allow an X marker or another non-binary classification. And about, I would say, the same amount of local jurisdictions within the US, Canada, and other countries where you have local jurisdictions that offer a non-binary sex designation, and it usually goes with a self-identification kind of policy. I mean, here we can see, I think, one of the most creative ones from Tasmania, 2019, in which one can choose to be either male, female, indeterminate gender, non-binary, or a word or a phrase that is used to indicate a person's perception of their self, of the person's self, as being neither entirely male nor entirely female, and that is perceived, or a legal text that says that you can choose any word you want to describe to be registered as your sex classification. And so we're seeing this deployment of non-binary sex classification, but they're a part of a broader, I would say, trans story of sex classification more broadly, and the need to reclassify one's sex. And so sex reclassification is one, I would say, from a legal perspective, one of the core issues of the trans legal movement, both of its radical and formal sides. And it's because people wish to access what is called proper identification documents for various reasons. I would name kind of like the three big ones. And the first one is recognition. People want and desire to have a public recognition of their identity as they see themselves. But in a more material kind of level and in a more complex analysis, we see this sex classification as sort of a license for discrimination. What I mean is that when you present yourself as male, but your ID marks you as female, that ID, that document becomes, signifies to whoever it's presented to, whether it's, the person at the grocery shop where you're buying alcohol, or it's the police officer, or it's somebody at City Hall. It signifies to them that the state refuses to see yourself as you see yourself, and therefore they should not treat you as the way you want to be treated. And that's how they become a license for discrimination, and the need for sex reclassification arise. And more specifically, trans population, trans and non-binary population are disproportionately exposed to homelessness, to poverty, to criminalization, and so forth, and so are in greater needs of accessing public spaces and services such as homeless shelters, and or they might end up in prison, or they might be homeless and they need to use a public restroom, toilet, and these places are, for the most part, gender segregated, and that's why a legal recognition might be very helpful and in need. And sex reclassification has been an issue for probably at least since sex has been classified. And we can see here, this is a document from 1906, and it's a birth certificate reissued to Carl Bell, probably the first person that we know of to have legally reclassified their sex after having some kind of gender affirmative surgery. The unknown what kind of gender affirmative surgery Carl Bell had, but in 1906 in Weimar, Germany, he got his sex to be reclassified and even got his birth certificate reissued, something that is very hard to do today, by the way. You can reclassify your identification document, but birth certificates are more complicated. And Carl Bell later immigrated to then Palestine and is buried in Kiryat Shaul. If you want to visit Carl Bell grave, the first person to have legally reclassified their sex after a gender affirmative surgery. And so I've surveyed these laws and policies addressing sex reclassification in about, I would say, 100 or 150 jurisdictions in the past years. And I've seen that in almost literally everywhere, anywhere around the globe, sex reclassification laws and policies have become the center of public and or legal debates. And we can classify kind of like what legal schemes we can find today around the globe. And so first off, we still would find places where there would be total ban on reclassification, conveying the idea that sex assigned at birth is immutable and is kind of like a stable truth of the bodies. And then we still would, and I would say complete ban on reclassification is found across the globe, from the richest kind of jurisdictions to the poorest one. And that goes to all other kind of legal schemes. And so sterilization requirements are where one is the prerequisite for legal recognition is to undergo genital related surgery or actual sterilization in order to access sex reclassification policies. And these legal schemes reflect the idea that genitals or a performance of reproductive capabilities are markers of true sex. Bodily modification prerequisites, in that I mean any other kind of medical intervention, whether it's hormone replacement therapy or any other kind of gender affirmative medical care. And these are jurisdictions. This is the most common, I would say, legal scheme around the world currently. And it means that somebody has to do something, you have to pay with blood in order to reclassify your sex, but it doesn't really matter whether it's a genital related surgery or any other kind of gender affirmative care. And it first, this kind of like schemes reflect current medical diagnosis protocols, where today, subjective gender identities are now authorized as legible, largely because they're believed to be rooted in a deep, stable, innate disposition. And so medical bodily modification are seen as tool of aligning some outer truth of the body to an inner truth, right? And so when people are recognized through this legal scheme, their inner truth is recognized through some act they do with their body. And the more kind of like advanced, I would say, quote unquote, schemes are the last two. And that's where we will also find the X markers or non-binary classifications, because it would be theoretically and practically impossible, I would say, to demand somebody to undergo any kind of gender affirmative care in order to access a non-binary classification, precluding intersex population, which I will address briefly. And so corroboration schemes is when you state your gender identity, say, I want to be a male, or I see myself as a female, or an X, or non-binary. But then you have to have that statement corroborated. It can be by somebody who knows you. In some places, it's done by a judge. Most commonly, it's done by a medical professional or a mental health professional. But in that situation, they're not supposed to diagnose you as either trans or non-trans, suffering from gender dysphoria or any other category they currently hold. But they corroborate what you say about yourself. And so in Israel, it looks like a doctor note saying, I know this and that person, and they should be regarded as male or female. And corroboration schemes, they do demedicalize gender identity, insofar as that they do not presume bodily modification or even a desire for modification, but they do not de-essentialize gender identity, which now becomes even more an immutable truth, right? Something to be discovered or to be corroborated by another. And the subjective truth of the applicant gender is made known through this third party who provides an objectivity to the subjective identity. Objectivity is very important to law. But if gender identity is subjective, right? If it's something I know, it's something that resides deep inside my heart, what other levels of truth does this third party add? What does the corroboration add? And this is where we come to self-identification policies. And these are laws and policies that rely only on one's statement or self-selection, as the US policy now defines it. And it means that you only need to come to the relevant bureaucratic agent and declare yourself to be male, female, non-binary, or any other word that describe you. And so we're seeing that with we're seeing this shift, right? It's kind of like a progress narrative, but it's not really a progress narrative because things move back and forward, and because I'm not sure if we are progressing, as we'll soon shortly we'll see. But if the first two kind of like legal schemes, sterilization or bodily modification, present grave harms to bodily autonomy and to autonomy more broadly, then corroboration schemes kind of like get rid of the harms to bodily autonomy. You no longer have to undergo any medical procedures you don't want to go through in order to get legal recognition. And here it's very important to make the difference between gender affirmative care one wants to access because this is their desire or the way they want to see and feel themselves, and when the state demands that you do so in order to get documents that allow you to live in society. And so corroboration scheme just moved to like kind of like a harm of autonomy more broadly, and formal self-determination, self-identification, self-selection, get rid of these grave breaches to autonomy, but they still rely on this alignment between internal truth and external truth. And what I mean, so this is a map. This is outdated map of jurisdiction around the world, allowing for self-determination or formal self-determination. There is more to add here, but today we're talking about maybe about 300 billion people around the world who live under this kind of law and policies. And how this is achieved legally, in legal terms, it's achieved through a definition of gender identity as a legal category. And here the definition coming from the Judicata principle of 2006 is written: gender identity is understood to refer to each person deeply felt internal and individual experience of gender. And it relies this idea that gender identity is something, it's an immutable trait. It's something that, you know, one has to be left alone, sitting in the dark quietly, and to look deeply inside their soul and find this immutable truth that needs to be protected from society and state intervention. And in practice, this act of self-identification is an act in which one proclaims that their gender identity is incongruent with their birth assigned sex. And so that's what I mean when there's an alignment of inner and outer truth. If before that it's an alignment of the body And the soul here, it's an alignment of one's inner gender identity and the other public truth of birth assigned sex. But what am I talking about when I'm talking about birth assigned sex? What is actually assigned in birth and how it's different from when I'm saying sex classification? And so factually, birth assignment of sex is this ritual occurring when a baby is born, and usually a medical professional, a nurse, a doctor looks at the baby's external genitals and declares them to be male or female. This information is documented on the birth certificate and becomes part of one's legal entity throughout their life and even post-mortem. It's a differentiated legal category. It creates two kinds of legal entities living aside corporations. But it's an act of administrative performativity, if I can use Butler to my own advantage here. And I would say it's something the state repeatedly imitates with every registration of birth for at least 200 years, right? It's a ritual like gender performativity more broadly that has no origin. It's how the administrative state creates its own identity as a space where coherent gender and sex bodies exist. But where I'm going with this, is somewhere a bit different. It can easily be argued that what is documented at birth are merely material facts of the body, right? They're looking at something and they're describing it in a document. They're seeing a penis, they're writing male, they're seeing a vagina, and they're writing female. But in that exact gap between the seeing, the body, and the word and the document, so many things lie. So whether the legal says, when we're talking about, TJ was talking about this dynamic between whether gender, what is gender or sex, social construct, biological characteristics, but whether legal sex classification refers solely to the most narrow biological distinction within the species, right? What is the most basic biological distinction between those who have large gametes and those who have smaller gametes? So whether it's relying or based on these very narrow biological distinctions, or whether it refers to the most broad kind of like social characteristic and abilities, what trans lived experience exposed to us is that female and male as a legal category are categories that index gender expectation. What I mean is that we expect those assigned male at birth to grow up and identify and be identified as men, and we expect those assigned female to grow up and identify and be identified as women. And we know this is policed in daily interactions between private and public, in private and public situation, because of what happens when you have when your gender presentation, performance, the way you look or feel yourself or identify is incongruent with your sex classification. And we know that trans people who have incongruent IDs, who have identification documents that or in general, when they break this rule of gender expectation, they are being they are exposed to discrimination and to harm. And because people who are gender non-conforming are exposed to this discrimination and harm, we know that everybody else is also sitting under or is under this very tense kind of policing. And so what is assigned at birth are these gender expectations. To put simply, legal sex, regardless of any other discussion, legal sex is socially constructed. And so the very claim for recognition of an innate gender identity, of something that's privately mine, is very problematic, binary or non-binary. given that the category that one demands to be recognized as is culturally contingent. And so while the applicant, the person who wants to reclassify their sex, is no longer required to be sterilized if they're going to the self-identification kind of route as a precondition for legal recognition, or they don't even have to have their identity corroborated by an external other, the self-determined gender or self-selected gender is recognized through a negation of the sex body, through saying that this assignment at birth and my own identity and experience are incongruent. And this claim of incongruence positions trans and non-binary people as others, as those who have gender identity, unlike those who have their birth assignment. In this world of birth assigned gender, of birth assigned gender expectation, what does self-identification entails? It entails, to be very catchphrasy, it entails redrawing the public-private line along the counters of the trans body. So one is entitled to this gender identity of the heart, but at the same time, they're affirming, or their act of self-identification, not something that they do or not do, affirms the broader public justification for assignment of sex at birth. Self-identification constitutes trans and non-binary subject as those as others, but by suggesting that only they have a gender identity, right? You have to come out as having a gender identity, going back to kind of like a Sedgwick coming out of the closet. And so a right to gender identity empowers the rational subject, the individual, the Western autonomous self as a sovereign being that can claim the recognition. But this claim depends on consenting to the state regimes of identity. And so the freedom offered to individuals by self-identification justifies the public compliance with gender expectation. And specifically, as birth assignment of sex rests on genital configuration, and so the baseline gender expectation is that the baseline gender expectation indexed in male and female categories is that those assigned men would be identified as male by a specific act, by representing themselves as if they have a penis, and vice versa. And here I'm obviously echoing Talia's Becher view that gender presentation represent genital status. And inside this framework, right, inside this framework of self-selection or self-identification, it's very questionable, we find the X markers, the non-binary markers. And so the X markers, where do they come from? And I'll be brief about that. There's an international, to have X markers on passport, it means there needs to be an international treaty, some kind of agreement that allows states to do so. And there's different legal documents on passports, and they include an X marker options way before non-binary discussion even began. They obviously began long ago, but in law at least. And there's some reports that they exist there post-World War II, when there were a lot of refugees, specifically Jewish refugees, and they were assigned passports through lists of names. The people assigning passport didn't even see those who were giving this refugee passport. And so because they couldn't recognize Eastern European names, they just marked X on the sex classification, and that's how X markers allegedly entered international law to begin with. But X markers have been around longer than I would say trans and non-binary demands to have them started, and they were assigned to intersex and DSD people with or without their consents. And here there's a conflict to begin with, and as I've heard in the recent WPATH conference in Buenos Aires, intersex advocates are very troubled with this idea of gender identity as something that makes X markers or sex classification legible to begin with. As they say, our issue is not with an innate gender identity, our issue is with the normalizing of bodies. And so when you push this out toward the discourse of gender identity, you're pushing us out of the conversation. We're the first people to be talked about and thought about in this context. Moreover, the X marker creates a non-binary binary because it is a kind of like gated legal category. And so what does it mean to be a non-binary in refer to a binary legal category? And what does it mean to be a non-binary category? These things are kind of like counterproductive in a sense. And so we're going back to the idea of why people need to reclassify their sex. And though I respect people who need or desire legal recognition in the sense that the state, the law will tell you that your identity is valid and accepted. If you want to have a non-binary designation because of the other reasons, because you don't want to be exposed to discrimination and to harm, or because you need access to gender segregated spaces, then you would not get that with a non-binary designation. And I have advised people to think hard if they want to have an X marker on a passport while traveling through different countries. And it's because the X markers, when we put them on a legal document, mark out gender non-conforming and non-binary people, allowing easier surveillance of people who fail to do gender or refuse to do gender normativity. And so thinking about the X marker, thinking about self-selection of sex classification from the perspective, from the lived perspective of trans and non-binary people, it seems that we should aim the eyes on the prize should be to end sex classification, to end best assignment of sex, rather than to find more and more ways to include our diversity and creativity inside them. And so I'll stop here, so we'll have time for questions, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was such an enjoyable time to listen to both of you, both TJ and Ido. I want to open up the floor. If anybody has questions, you can either write in the chat or you can speak. You can raise your hand.
I guess I'll start because everybody's volunteering at once. So for TJ, I have a question. So for literature now, right? Who are the voices we should be reading, should be listening to, should be looking for? Who are the bodies, the agents, so on and so forth? You talk about how Butler was over theorizing and Hooks was under theorizing. You know, I know of Kate Bernstein, or I believe his first name is Leonard. I could be totally wrong, but Ziman in sociolinguistics. Do you have any other names?
So I'm less familiar with the literature side, except for where it kind of crosses over into media studies. But I do know, for example, a lot of my own work has been influenced by the work of Kyle Keegan, who's done a lot of work on trans cinema. Laura Horak has also done a lot of work in that space. I mean, to be honest, like TSQ as a forum has its limitations, but also has lots of wonderful work that's being contributed by trans thinkers that are allowing them to kind of think beyond necessarily trying to fit things into the kind of gender or sexuality frames that might be required if they were to be publishing in like GLQ or somewhere. And so we do see not necessarily individual people who have like established themselves necessarily as kind of a new canon, so to speak, to whatever value a canon may or may not be, but lots of individual examples of what I find to be a kind of burgeoning approach to trans critique that is particularly useful.
Good. And then I guess a quick follow-up. You know, there's at least in the US, it's not necessarily appropriative, but when we think of someone who's white writing in critical race theory, right, we don't necessarily take it as less serious, but we kind of look at it as there's something there.
Yes.
Do we feel the same way in someone who's cis aligned doing the same thing in trans studies, or?
I mean, I suppose it depends on what your definition of me is. So, I mean, to a certain extent, yes. I think, obviously, as with any intellectual domain, identity is not epistemology. That's, you know, obvious to all of us, I think. But I do think that there is, particularly when we're discussing issues of like deep subjectivity, like there is an inherent kind of contradiction in trying to be a not trans person writing about that, because of the ways that like there's a language and a community of inquiry that you lack access to in that way. But I think that we all are encouraging and would like for trans analysis to be taken up for all of the value that it has for our broader thinking about society, right? Like trans perspectives on gender-based subordination, like don't simply produce trans thought, they also challenge, caveat, and speak back to feminist and queer critiques as well. So I do think that the incorporation of trans analysis into theorizing for everyone should be encouraged, regardless of cis or trans identity of the author. And part of it also has to do with, you know, that same discussion we have in media representation about casting trans actors in trans roles. It also has to do with like the politics of fields and like the representation of voices in fields when we think about, you know, scholars as laborers and producers of knowledge in industry that is historically hostile to them. And so part of it also has to do with that. And so the Center for Applied Transgender Studies that I helped found and that I run consists of trans scholars who do trans scholarship. We have no cis scholars in our ranks, and that is not, that's not just because we think cis scholars couldn't produce good knowledge for our work. It's also about our investment in building a pipeline in our profession for trans people to advance further than they've been able to historically advance.
Thanks. I think I saw that Gilly raised her hand.
Yes, I did. Thank you. So I have a question for both of you. TJ, you kind of touched on this now, but maybe Estelle, I would very much like for you to elaborate on why you think feminist thinking cannot accommodate transgender realities, because I think this is, I think feminist theory should at least try, or maybe work a little bit harder than it does today in order to be able to progress and produce a more relevant theory for lives, for all of our lives, both trans and cis people. So I think that by saying this, you kind of give up on it. And I would think that we should fight for feminist thought, at least because it's where I came from, and I think it has more to offer to the future. And so I would really like for you to maybe elaborate a little bit more on why you say that, and how do you think we should use or maybe abandon or work with feminist theory? And Ido, I was really thinking about the what you said at the end about the X category, and that you advise people not to use it because it's dangerous, and I really appreciate it, and I think it is dangerous. But I would say that maybe a good practice we could engage in is to maybe ask or maybe promote its usage by cis people, in order to enable more trans people to use it, and in a way that won't harm them or be dangerous. So I'm thinking maybe not to abandon the X category because it's dangerous, but maybe encourage everyone to use it.
So I guess I'll go first just to answer in the order that you asked. So to clarify my position on this, I do not think that either feminist thought or queer thought should be kind of thrown out. I'm arguing for what I view as the limitations of its ability to theorize trans realities. And there have been extents to which feminist thought are being reconstructed in ways that are useful. I'm kind of very much speaking of a dominant strain of feminist theory here that is kind of dominant at my institution, I'm sure at your institution and others, that because it's so invested in this hierarchy of subordination model, it finds itself unable to accommodate a system where there are more categories that don't fall into a hierarchy in such a clearly defined way. But as I kind of mentioned in passing, American Black feminist thought, for example, and its focus on the ungendering of the Black body has done a lot to disrupt the idea of feminist theorizing rooted in that kind of gendering, and has been a very productive thought bridge between contemporary trans studies and contemporary feminist thought. And I also think that there are other approaches to feminist theory that have attempted to do this, Julia Serrano being the most famous example with her kind of concept of trans misogyny, which is a really rich and fruitful model for bridging, but that also, again, doesn't necessarily overcome those problems I'm describing because it does require the template of misogyny in order to trace those dynamics. So it is kind of a bounded argument about a specific subset of the trans population. So I think that what I feel is necessary for feminist thought, not to be useful in general, but to be useful for trans thinking in this way, would require it to take seriously the challenge that trans identity poses to its existing theoretical models, and to reconstruct in a way where gender is viewed not necessarily categorically, but as I said, perhaps as a vector or as something that can be analyzed as kind of a macro force rather than a set of discrete categories that exist in relation to one another. And I do think that that type of theorizing is nascent within contemporary feminist thought for sure.
Okay, I'll just jump in. I would say that I appropriate whatever parts of feminism or queer theory I wish. I think it's a trans studies privilege. I sometimes do that. I also tend to assume that people writing in trans studies might be trans, but that's my techniques of dealing with the tension. They're real. So first about cis people or non-trans people or gender conforming people using the X marker and gender non-conforming people using the X marker. I think even if both groups would do that, I feel that the chances, that the gender conforming person with an X marker would have a nice, interesting conversation with the person at the border, while the person who's gender non-conforming would be harassed, searched, whatever, and so right, because the level of policing somebody who's gender conforming experience, even if they decided one day to do something that's a tiny bit gender non-conforming, compared to the level of violence not gender non-conforming people and trans people and trans women specifically and trans women of color specifically are exposed to is really unparalleled. I don't think it would be straining out in that way. But I think more broadly, my critique is that gender identity as the legal category is a double-edged sword. And I feel that trans and non-binary movements are kind of evacuating the category of sex for many good reasons. But in effect, it's creating this situation that I think is not even in the benefit of cis people and of cis women, because it's making the category of sex be about imagined as immutable truth about people's and bodies, and it leaves this legal structure in which we have differentiated legal statuses given to us at birth because of our genitals, untouched. And so more that I'm interested, and I really respect of people's my critique of gender identity is not of gender identity as a subjective experience, which I respect and I experience myself, but as a legal category. And I think as a legal category, it's not, we're going that way, it's happening, but it has a lot of repercussions that we're already seeing.
some really interesting comments and the questions in the chat. And I think this one is for really, on the one hand, there's one for Gilly, and on the other one, there's for Cído. And Gilly, I think the question's already been kind of answered by Cído in some ways, the difference between ex-gender and cancelling the entire category. But following on from that, what are the generally accepted benefits of having a sex marker on legal documents? Are they related to data? Are they related to health or to crime?
So that's the main kind of like pushback I get on these ideas, and saying, and specifically because in law we have in the US law less, in Israeli law more, we have this use of sex categories, of female sex categories, to amend some historical injustice. We have some tax benefits for female classified people. There's different kind of like tiny little loopholes within family law, which is generally horrible to women. And there's these different ways, there's some kind of affirmative action frameworks and representation compliances of the state relying on sex classification. And so people ask me, if you want to get rid of M&F, you're also going to get rid of this tiny little protections feminism has managed to put inside the law. And I think there's different ways to answer this, right? For affirmative action, for taxes, for stuff like that, we don't have to have this as part of our legal data, our legal entity throughout our life and death. We can self-identify for a specific purpose, as done with other kind of like categories, right? We have this different mechanism to address people who've been historically disadvantaged on the background of race or disability, or in Israel for Orthodox people, without having that as part of the public registrar. So there's already systems in place to deal with that. And regarding other kind of forms of data that is needed, like medical data, medical statistic, on crime, I'm not sure how this data is useful, but given that data is useful in different contexts, I still don't think we have to attach it to somebody's actual identity. We can register for, say, we have to register all birth, whether one was born with a vagina or a penis. We can do that without attaching that data to their legal entity and just collecting statistical data as done in other kind of aspects.
Ronit.
So thank you very much. I guess I want to ask TJ, but perhaps Cído has something to say about that as well. How would you respond to the feminist accusation that the transgender category, and perhaps more so the transsexual category, actually bring back in the back door essentialism?
Yes, so I mean, I think that there's been a long kind of history of this debate. In fact, one of the kind of originating texts of transgender studies as a field was Sandy Stone's post-transsexual manifesto that was kind of meant as a response to that very idea. And I think that was published in like 96, 94, something like that. And so one of the major ways in which this does not reinscribe essentialism from a transanalytic perspective is because of its like natural detachment of an idea of innateness, right? The idea of autonomy over not just social presentation, but also biological presentation decenters biology as the site and origin of one's sex or gender. The body becomes mutable in the same way that the social becomes mutable. And so like, yes, there is an extent to which an individual trans person may feel, either for personal reasons or advance for strategic reasons, the narrative that, well, I was born in the wrong body, I am in my true heart and soul a woman, I must transition. That doesn't necessarily reflect on the category or the practice writ large. And kind of more importantly, we do know from a lot of the historical record that these narratives of these kind of re-essentializing narratives of identity have been deployed by trans people to placate cisgender gatekeepers. So we have records, for example, of Agnes at UCLA in the 60s, who tried to create this artificial intersex narrative in order to convince the doctors that she was deserving of that care, because they're operating in a context, even still today often, where the cisgender medical providers who must authorize these changes have their own essentialist ideals that trans people then rhetorically appeal to in order to motivate. I think, though, that within kind of trans thought and theory, there isn't really a place for that kind of essentialism. Trans theory has like rejected the idea that transness is, born this way, kind of inherent quality that must be altered. Or it's not altered, that must be enacted through bodily alteration.
Caido, do you want to respond?
I would just kind of like add something to what TJ was talking to us about, the wrong body narrative, and I think these are the exact narrative that we see in the spectrum of sex classification schemes. And so if like the sterilization and genital related stuff represent this old version of the story where one has to go to surgery in order to reveal their true sex, gender identity as a legal category still essentialize an innate something, right? The innate identity. And then the body is still wrong because it has to be incongruent with birth assignment. And I think this kind of like socially, this framework of gender identity, I would say, is not a framework coming from trans theory, but more from the way women and gays of lesbians have entered formal equality by claims of we are just like you except X and Y. And so this wrong body narrative that keeps coming back to trans people, at least in legal terms, is not coming from I would say trans experiences or theory.
Thanks. Brandon.
So I guess as a follow-up to that, I teach on epidemia, but in general, I'm a public school teacher in addition to completing my PhD. So I guess the question is to follow up, how do we support trans narratives in the classroom? And I don't know if either one of you, because it's neither of your fields, can answer that question. But if we're talking about this, avoiding the re-essentialization of gender, right? To put it into perspective, the Ministry of Education has no resources. 1995, sexual orientations was a brochure they put together, got all the information, never distributed it. So how do we support these narratives while also trying to combat non-essentialism? I also don't know if there's an answer. So if you feel that there's no answer, please say no.
Well, my immediate answer is I teach university students and not primary school students so that I don't need to deal with those kinds of problems. But I do think that it's an important question that I don't have an answer to, but that I do know. So for example, in Illinois, which is the state that Chicago is in, you have no reason to know that necessarily. I'm not sure I knew that until recently. So the state of Illinois has recently passed a law that is requiring state agencies to collect sexual orientation and gender identity data. And I'm part of the group that is advising them on how to implement this law. And one of the issues that we've dealt with in working with the Illinois State Board of Education is thinking through how do we collect this data from primary school students who are 6, 7, 8, when like they do frequently have an understanding of gender that rivals many adults, but also that we're also used to being able to ask these questions in terminologies that aren't necessarily going to be accessible to those children. And we haven't found an answer yet, but I do think that one of our kind of central concerns is the very thing that you're talking about. We don't want to be inscribing those ideas in that kind of children's book way of, well, we'll talk about the world as being really simple and you'll just learn it's more complicated later, because we don't want to be teaching those artificial narratives. So like, I do think it's a problem that everybody is having at the same time.
It's also super interesting because wasn't Illinois the first state to put into motion that queer history has to be taught in school? It was Illinois, wasn't it?
Possibly, I'm not certain, but it might have been. We have a very strangely progressive legislature for a not very progressive citizenry here, so it's very possible.
I think for me, and I'm not sure how to do it in epidemia, it's very helpful to distinguish between gender as a legal category, gender as an apparatus of power, and gender as a personal subjective experience. And I think they're very different. Gender is very different on each and every one of these levels. And I think, not sure what to do with, with the kids, but there's more and more of them and they're less and less binary. And I think we just need to affirm them and let them, speak their stories and bring their voices out. And they're making more mess than I can ever imagine to do while writing about the law.
Wonderful. I'm very aware of the time and I feel like this conversation could go on for at least another hour. And want to thank Caido and TJ so much for your time and your thoughts. And I really hope that this inspires. Because we're at time, I feel like we need to wrap up, but to respect other people's time as well. But I do want to thank. I want to thank the Queer Queries and also those professors and tutors that have been supporting us to actually facilitate this colloquium, which, if I can say it correctly, might be the first colloquium that we've had that really goes into queer theory and to trans theory. What a wonderful experience it is indeed. And if anybody has any questions, I'm sure that both Caido and TJ would be more than happy to continue the conversation through email or through other forms. So thank you so much, TJ and Caido. I really, I can't tell you how much it means to us. And hopefully we will continue this conversation throughout the rest of the year and probably even more. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful.